Welcome to another episode of the MEGIN Spotlight series. Today we are delighted to welcome Emily Portis. We were introduced to Emily at an advocacy event last summer hosted by the Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance, our wonderful advocacy group partner. After meeting Emily and her daughter Jenna there, she kindly agreed to share her caregiver's perspective on her daughter's epilepsy diagnosis and surgery journey with us. Hi Emily, how are you?
I'm doing well. Hello.
So let me start off with the first question then. Can you provide an introduction to your daughter's epilepsy journey, and how old was she when she was diagnosed, and what type of epilepsy did she have?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So Jenna began seizing when she was about 6 months old. Jenna had been normal except late preterm and birth, but otherwise developmentally appropriate. It was just a regular Saturday morning. I actually had slept in the guest room because she had woken up a couple of times during the night, and it was just easier for my husband and I. And she had just recently learned to kick her legs like up and down. And so at first, I thought she was doing that. She was sleeping beside me. I breastfed and kept her next to me oftentimes during the night. And I thought she was practicing that skill. And then when I kind of woke up, I realized, in fact, she was twitching and shaking. And I cried out, and my husband came in there, but our other child had had a febrile seizure. So I just kind of assumed that that's what it was. And we took her temperature. She had no fever. And then, um, we took her to the hospital, and they really didn't have a good explanation at that point of what was going on. There wasn't any obvious tumor or mass in her scans, and she had Todd's palsy after that first seizure, where she had some weakness in the affected arm. And so, we were kind of left with a lot of questions. They just had us follow up with a neurologist later, but she started seizing more often that week. And so they got us in pretty quickly, and we did an EEG. And then they diagnosed her with just idiopathic epilepsy, no real good reason for why she was seizing.
So you previously told us that your daughter was suspected to have intractable epilepsy at 6 months old, and following the next 3 years, she failed 7 medications, which must have been quite a journey already. And then at what stage
Yes.
did you realize that you may need to pursue the surgical option for your daughter?
So there were several times that Jenna would have periods of status epilepticus where she would require medication in order to stop the seizures at home, because they were happening back to back to back with no break, or they were lasting for really long periods of time. And after we tried to do those rescue meds at home, if we were still having trouble controlling her seizures, she required a couple of ambulance rides to the hospital in order to be cared for. And so on one of those admissions, when they put her on the EEG, what we were seeing at home was only the tip of the iceberg, because while she was having clinical seizures, what we didn't know, or what I didn't know as the mom, is that she was actually having subclinical seizures too. So those were seizures that were happening in the brain, but weren't having any outward side effects that I could visually see. And so once they determined that she truly was having so many seizures that we weren't aware of, that's when they began to start recommending a surgical option. And so originally they had a team meeting with all of the caregivers and the healthcare providers, and they determined that she would be a candidate for surgery at that time.
So then tell us, originally you heard about MEG, how you heard about MEG, and why you decided to seek out the technology for your daughter. How did this data from your daughter's MEG scan inform the decision-making process then when you decided to move forward with the brain surgery?
So actually, she had the surgery first, and the surgery involved a partial resection of her left temporal and occipital lobes of her brain. That controlled her seizures for about 2 months, which was really about the longest we had gone once she began seizing with no seizures. But unfortunately, right at 2 months, the seizures returned, and they were almost identical to before in frequency, severity, and appearance, the way that they presented. And so once we had the seizures return, her surgeon was very flippant about recommending a more aggressive surgery. And I say that as a healthcare provider, I have a relationship with the physicians that's different than a typical parent because I'm comfortable with medical lingo, I'm comfortable in the hospital setting, and I'm comfortable with surgical interventions because I do that as part of my career. And, but they were just so casual about how they recommended it. And at that point, I felt like I really needed a second opinion or more information on which to base my decision other than, well, the surgeon told me this. And my dad happened to see a segment on Good Morning America about a child who had seizures and required surgery. And part of their surgical workup was this MEG scan. And so I was very interested in that. And unfortunately, at the time, this technology was very new and it wasn't available where I am locally. So I had to travel to get that. And in order to get that testing done, it did require a second opinion and a workup by a different provider. And so in that, I knew that I wanted that testing done. And I heard about it on the news by somebody who was willing to share their story in the way that I want to share mine to help other people.
So quite a lot of work from your perspective, research having to get to that point really, which is, and if someone doesn't have the background that you have, I guess, in the profession is quite daunting, I would think, to go on that journey then. How did the data from your daughter's MEG scan influence the decision-making then, the process, so when deciding to move forward with the hemispherectomy?
So the data from the MEG scan was used to determine whether her speech had moved over to the unaffected side of her brain, because even in left-handed individuals, the statistics we were given is still about 85% have the speech center in the left side of the brain. And so unfortunately, Jenna was a little young, so they weren't able to definitively give us that information from the MEG scan, but that was one of the goals, was to evaluate those areas more in depth and see if there was bigger risk for loss of speech with the surgery itself. And she had other testing, including PET scan and things like that, but it just offered me peace of mind that we had used information to give us the best data possible for making the decision.
How's Jenna doing today then? She's now 16, 17 years old.
Yes, ma'am. She's doing very well. She has remained seizure-free since her surgery on December 23rd of 2010. She has the expected outcomes from the surgical procedure itself, like visual impairment, mobility impairment, and cognitive impairment. But she's a joy and a delight. When people meet her, spend time with her, they very rarely understand the complexity of her diagnosis and her surgery, because from the outside, it's hard to see her deficits that aren't physical. And so we are very grateful for the surgical option and wish that we had been able to do it sooner, as we know that that can help improve the outcomes even more. But we're just grateful for what we have.
Oh, well, I'm really pleased to hear that. That's amazing. So we appreciate you spending time with us today as an advocate for brain surgery awareness and supporting the advancements of treatments. Can you tell our audience what groups you're involved with and why you decided to work with these groups and how they've helped you in the journey?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So my primary involvement with pediatric epilepsy and surgical groups is through the Hemispherectomy Foundation. We actually stumbled upon them prior to Jenna having her hemispherectomy by searching and Googling back in the day. I think it was on Yahoo probably. And we found them, and they were instrumental in providing support for us and helping in understanding what our expected outcomes would be. We also have been very active with the Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance, because they really support patients whose children or who individuals are going through such radical processes to help epilepsy surgery patients. And so we I love the support that I've gotten from those groups. We were involved with our local epilepsy.org community originally, but because we had a surgical option, we have gone down the avenues that are more geared towards patients who have surgery.
Oh, that's great. So what is your one piece of advice that you would give to parents who are facing similar challenges you faced sort of 13 plus years ago now?
So the biggest piece of advice that I would give a parent or a caregiver going through something like this is try to rest and take care of yourself so that you can know that you're putting the energy forth to make the best decisions that you can. Ask a lot of questions, lean into community, whether that's family, spiritual, groups like the Pediatric Epilepsy Surgery Alliance, Facebook groups, or wherever you find that. The community aspect is so important to have people that are supporting you and rallying around you. Ask a lot of questions, ask a lot of questions, ask a lot of questions, and then trust your intuition and know that you are making the best decision that you can for the child in your charge with what information that you have at the time. And there's things that I would do differently in hindsight, but you can't Monday morning quarterback this. You can't look back and question what you did. So trust your instincts and be confident in the decisions that you made.
And I guess having the, the amount of data that you had available around all this before you made that decision was obviously helpful, I would think, to go down that path as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Emily, for your time today. This has been extremely informative for our audience, and it's an honor for us to be able to share insights from the perspective of a parent and your journey with your child, with Jenna. So thanks again for sharing your story with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.